just so you know who everybody is up there, but let me say a couple things about this panel and why I'm so excited about it. Yuping is one of the people out in the academic world, and there are not many that are focused on the topic at hand. Yuping and I met, I don't know, a long time ago. She runs the Loyalty Science Lab at Old Dominion University, and she brings an academic perspective, but she's grounded in the real world. Doug Glazer, somebody I've known for a long time too. Doug comes from places like Amazon Prime and Nordstrom, and now he's at Fanatics, not too shabby. And then Courtney, who's a relatively new friend, and with Target. I think everybody's heard of Target. She's been with Delta Airlines. I think everybody's, if you've ever heard me talk about loyalty, you'll hear lots of Delta Airlines stories, and Nike. So these people know what they're doing, and that's why they're here. And they're working to get loyalty unstuck in their organizations. But first, I want to kick it off being grounded in research and data and insight. So Yuping, we've talked about this topic. I first published the topic of loyalty unstuck on the Loyalty Science Lab site. How do you see this, and what are the unstuck points as much as the stuck points?
Sure. I wanted to thank you for actually writing that article for us. I think it's a very good point. We were doing a re-envisioning loyalty series, and the point is that we are truly in a stuck point. I wanted to, perhaps going with what you were saying about loyalty stuck, talk about an analysis that we did of 50 years of retail loyalty studies. This were involved about hundreds of studies where we look at a lot of studies looking at what drives customer loyalty in that retail space. And we classify these things into 3 different categories. So we're looking at one category is the typical things where you would think about product breadth, product depth, assortment, pricing matters. So what we call rational kind of factors. And then we also look at emotional related factors, things like customer satisfaction, emotional connection, and so forth, and as well as social factors, which are looking at things like social influence from others, and as well as looking at even relationship with the employees potentially would be part of that as well. And so when we look at this, the importance of these factors over time, about half a century, I guess, what we saw is that the rational thinking factors, the importance held. Okay, so I'm not going to say that the product is not important, the price is not important. That influence is actually quite flat, actually, over the course of time. But what we also saw over that time period is the really importance of that, emotional kind of related factors. As well as the social related factors. So if I were to kind of rank the 3 things in terms of the degree of impact they can potentially have on loyalty, the emotional factors is actually coming up as number 1 at this point, particularly in the online space, that we saw even more of the evolution of that in the online space. So.
Loyalty is an emotional state, right? Loyalty leads to a willingness to go out of your way and pay a premium for a brand. It's a brand-driven relationships, which is why that emotional point, that emotional context, is what's missing when everything is transactional. And to the point Yuping made, it's not like transactional value has to go away. It's not going away. But if it's not layered with emotion, it's not going to be sustainable beyond the immediate point in time and literally that transaction, which is a great segue. I'll start with you, Courtney, just because of you're relatively new to Target, but it's not, you've been part of this work in some of the world's best brands and true loyalty leaders.
Truly. And that's the interesting thing with now coming to Target. They've had different iterations of loyalty, but this is really the first time they're making a concerted effort to bring card, delivery, and a free program together. And what the real untapped potential is, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, is how do you take that brand component, that brand loyalty that Target has, that differentiated experience, and really use that to focus on the consumer experience, and then use that to drive loyalty, and then prove that out in the financials, and prove that out to kind of what you were talking about. So I think that's the really big opportunity for Target today, and bringing my experience from Delta and from Nike and from JetBlue, especially with airlines, you have that flying tube in the sky, you have that captive audience, that's your experience, and how do you really use that experience to drive that irrational loyalty? So that's what we're really focused on at Target, and we're on a journey. I mean, they're gonna hit their first year in April, we're gonna hit our anniversary, so a lot more opportunity to come.
Doug, aside from your background with some of those other good Seattle brands, you guys sit at this interesting place because, and my friend Matt Garrett's done, and others have done a lot of work on fandom, and we're going to hear about that much more over the course of the next 2 days. But you guys are tapping into emotional loyalty that already exists, which is a little bit different role and different way to play.
It is. We harness the love that our customers bring for their teams or their sport, and that is a big driver. But Fanatics is at an interesting place because we actually have, just to be totally candid, a fair amount of brand debt that we have to level up before we even can think beyond a lot of the mechanics of a loyalty program. And the company had sort of a moment about 2 years ago. We announced that Fanatics was going to be the new provider of the NHL's on-ice jerseys. And it's the first time Fanatics is going to appear with our logo on a professional league. We've actually been producing Major League Baseball's uniforms for years, before last year's kerfuffle with Nike, very successfully, but no one knew it was Fanatics. So this was the first time that customers were going to see the Fanatics flag front and center on every NHL player. And far from embracing it, there was a tremendous customer backlash online. And sometimes you go out and do the research, and sometimes the research finds you. And it wasn't hard to see that there was so much hostility and distrust for what Fanatics was going to bring to these iconic jerseys that we had to completely rethink not just our product, but our storytelling and our focus on the customer. And so over the last 2 years, there has been a huge transformation, particularly within the commerce organization, for how we think about the customer and how everything we do doesn't start with growth. It starts with the customer and ask, where does growth come from there? And I know this sounds very basic, but it's hard to execute well when you are in a high growth company. And there have been fits and stops, but for the most part, this is a path that we're committed to. We have a very rational financial free cash flow goal, but our other goal, which is a little more amorphous, is to become a beloved brand. And to never be in the situation again where we announce a major initiative that doesn't get anything but embraced by our fan community.
And we've seen a lot of examples of that sort of negative emotion, that whether it's a brand move like that or it's a devaluation. We saw that with Starbucks and Dunkin'. We saw it with Dunkin' Donuts on what everybody used to watch, the nightly network news. You never, even today, you don't want to be that guy who ends up having your brand talked about by Lester Holt. Yuping, what have you seen in the recent? I mean, you're tracking emotion, but the negative emotion is, like in the airline industry, right? Service recovery is a real thing because nobody's perfect. You got to acknowledge it, deal with it, and move on. What does the academic research say about negative incidents like that and the recovery?
So I would probably say that, human nature from a psychology perspective, we all have a negativity bias. So in other words, negative things tend to affect us more than positive things. So that's the bad side. If customers have a bad experience, it can have a tremendous impact on individuals, on consumers' feeling about your brand and so forth. However, I would say one encouraging finding from the service literature particularly is that if you mess up, over the course of time is inevitable. But if you are doing a good job in terms of recovering from the service failures, from the negative experiences people have had, it tends to have a positive impact, even more so than prior to the service failure. So I think that rebounding back, not just to the original level, but even potentially higher, I think can be an encouraging thing for organizations. Of course, you don't want it to mess up intentionally in the first place, but if you do encounter that kind of situation, how you deal with customers in that situation really matters a whole lot.
I mean, Courtney, I don't know if you want to speak to, this isn't about Target, this is actually about Delta.
Delta, yeah.
When they made those changes, you were still there.
Yes, I sure was. No, it was a really good learning, I think, to the point you were making, the research finds you. And what I think Delta has done a really good job of, and generally in airlines and what we're working to do at Target, is bring that customer experience component and that loyalty component, if they don't sit together already, bringing them together. So bringing in the insights teams, bringing in your data research, and just having all of those points together so that you can make the right move. But to Yuping's point, when it doesn't go right, how do you recover from that? How do you flip the trip is what we would call it at Delta. And so with the announcements that were made, what was that, 2 years ago now? That was a really big learning for us about going back to our members, really listening to them and understanding, okay, what are your true pain points? And then also, letting it play out and letting the strategy kind of prove itself, because I think now what you're seeing is people realize, okay, this is actually not so bad, right? This isn't the end of the world. And so I think it's a little bit of that balance of using data to inform the strategy in the upfront, but then also letting things kind of play out, ensuring that you have the service recovery in place, but then also kind of letting your strategy prove itself out. So it was a little bit of kind of in the upfront and then in the back end recovering, but it was definitely a huge learning for all of us of how do you listen to customers, how do you really speak to the customer, level with them on what you're trying to do, and just show up authentically as a brand.
And it certainly helps to have a CEO who gets it.
Yes, 100%. And that was having Ed behind us for that piece was really important. And I think that's the big thing just across the board as we talk about loyalty being unstuck. Having that leadership, having that C-suite support is something that, it sounds basic, but it is something that you really have to prove out and take time to prove out and get that C-suite on your side so that you can continue to kind of do the work, experiment, innovate.
Okay, Doug, where should we go with that? This.
Well, I'm chuckling because Phil, a couple years ago, and you gave us a hand. We built the infrastructure that's necessary for loyalty and our currency, which we call FanCash, to operate across our different business units. So today, customers can earn FanCash in our sportsbook and redeem it on our commerce sites, or they can earn it on our collectibles site and spend it somewhere else. So all of this, that plumbing is necessary and it's hard. And getting our C-suite to accept the level of effort that was going to require and the potential that loyalty could drive was a lot of work. We did that work. We got their buy-in. If anything now, we have too high expectations for how fast we can go, and the enthusiasm for doing more faster can become a little bit of its own burden and a little bit randomizing. So I think we're at a point now where there's so many great ideas, so much excitement for fans that we have to rein it in and be realistic about what we can achieve because we still live within the bounds of technology and execution and all of those things.
A little different than 7th Avenue.
Yeah.
Especially today. Okay, so Doug's point, who would rather be stuck or unstuck to the point where the pressure dials up because they want more faster? Who wants to be stuck and who wants to be unstuck? if we're overly risk averse, this isn't going to happen. Just, but it's hard to sustain that. I mean, to go back to Nordstrom, not to pick on Nordstrom, but I think it's worth bringing up because they were always considered so legendary.
Yeah.
Things got stuck there.
Yeah, I've been thinking about, there's company loyalty, being a loyalty company, as we've talked about, and having a loyalty program. And I think you and I would agree that at least a decade ago, Nordstrom's loyalty program was pretty ho-hum. But the company's loyalty to its customers was still legendary, and that lived at the stores. And that's the culture, I think, that people think about when they think about Nordstrom and loyalty, not the mechanics of the credit card or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Something we started talking about, I don't know, 10 plus years ago, the idea that it's not about the customer proving their loyalty to the brand. The brand's got to show loyalty to the customer. And that's where the feeling comes in. That's where the emotion comes in. And it's easy to say that. It's much harder to do that, to stick with positionings, and really brand strategies that live that up. We got 3 minutes to go. Everybody gets 60 seconds. What kind of advice would you give to everybody sitting here with us listening in terms of top 3 things to help move things forward, allows for some innovation?
I can go.
You start, you
Yeah,
can.
I can get. It's interesting, George and I were talking about this earlier with retail and with travel. The real difference is for loyalty in retail, the business isn't beholden to your performance, but I think proving out the need for loyalty financially, I think is the really important thing. And so it sounds super basic, it's not rocket science, and I know we're going to talk about it probably tomorrow, is incremental value, just proving that out and really kind of sticking to the message that you want to provide to your leadership teams on the value of the program. I don't think that's something that can be understated. I think that that's incredibly important, especially as we move into a world where margins are crunched, companies are looking for cost savings. That I think is the one thing that cannot be underscored enough.
Yeah, I was going to say something pretty similar, a slightly different spin. One is not only do you have to prove that value, you have to continually prove that value. So having a culture of test and learn, I think, is critical. The other thing is if you are truly going to be a data-driven company, which I think everyone would agree is the right orientation, don't be afraid of the data. It's going to be what it's going to be, and if the data gives you a signal that indicates that maybe the value as you're doing it today isn't there, then face that hard truth, because it will ultimately drive more value for your customers and the company.
Great points.
One thing I will add to all of that is that once you have the metrics to be able to prove your value, one of the higher level arguments I would make is that I think any business, the business model itself needs to have a loyalty strategy in it. I'm not talking about loyalty program strategy, but loyalty strategy in general. A lot of times when we think about marketing, we're thinking about unique selling propositions. What I think needs to happen is a unique loyalty proposition for any business at all. So if we can get to that level, then I think becoming customer obsessed will no longer be such a problem for businesses.
I'm not going to add anything to what you guys said other than to repeat it, and that is it's got to be measured and it's got to be demonstrated in P&L terms, in balance sheet terms. Plug for tomorrow's session that Mike Ridgewell is going to moderate with Dan McCarthy from Theta and University of Maryland, and Len Laguno, who is not only a sponsor, but he is the actuary. He is the one that helps people make sure their balance sheets are not stuck. That is going to be an incredible session. And I think, Doug, your point about testing and learning is spot on, because that's the evidence. An old boss said, we work in an intellectual democracy. Data, metrics drive decisions. And I think Yuping, your point is, I love that point. We've talked about it a lot. Loyalty is not just a marketing thing. Loyalty belongs in the business strategy and the business plan, and it needs to be measured. And like for public companies and for private companies, it's got to be measured to a point where it's reported, because that forces the accountability. You manage what you measure. That was amazing. You guys were great. Thank you so much. And we're on time. Yes.